In this lesson, we learn about a very important topic, deflection. In other words, removing the guard. It happens all the time, in all kind of positions and in every stage of the game. Let me start with a basic example. Here we go in a sample position where black has the option to capture white's pawn on c3 in two ways, either with a queen offering a trade of queens or with the rook. Try to see which one would you prefer. You may think that it doesn't really matter, both are okay. However, one of them would be a major mistake. And that is capturing with the queen. Capturing with the rook would be just fine, and the position would be close to equal. Let's talk about what happens after black indeed captures that pawn with the queen, which is a blunder. Be very careful of such tricks, because it's very, very common. Now, of course, white will not trade queens, but will play a typical deflection move, that is moving the rook up to e8 and say check. Obviously now black cannot do anything else but capture that rook, and then the rook's hand that was reaching out to protect the queen on c3 has to go in another direction, and therefore now the queen is unprotected, and of course white gained material. Going back to the starting position after queen c3, rook e8, in some other situations, then the black king could move out of the check, which it cannot here because the h7 square is also guarded by the white queen. That wouldn't save the situation either, because if the king could move to h7, white then would trade the queens, and then the rook in the corner would be hanging as well. After this simple example, let's move on to a bit more complex ones. This position has arisen from a real game between Grandmaster Lev Polugayevsky versus International Master Szilágyi. Here is quite notable that the black king on h6 is in a very sensitive position. Just imagine if the white rook would be able to come right now to d3, threatening to checkmate on h3, game would be over. However, it's not quite that simple, because if white would try to do that immediately, of course the black rook would capture the white rook on d3. So what should white do? Well, there is a very nice way to deflect that black rook from d8, where it's right now, guarding the d3 square. Try to think for a moment before you continue listening to the solution. And the solution is moving the bishop to f8 check. A very forceful move. Of course, if the black king would move out of the check to h5, rook takes pawn on h7 would be checkmate immediately. On the other hand, after rook captures the bishop, white is ready to safely bring the rook to d3, and now the checkmate on h3 is unavoidable. What a brilliant combination. And now let's move on to another position, which is a true middle game position that looks quite interesting. In this position, black is a pawn ahead. However, it's quite clear that white has an attack with the half-open h-file, where the white rook already is positioned, and also it's quite obvious the difference in strengths and power between the two bishops. White's bishop on d5 is very dominant, controlling a key diagonal, in fact two key diagonals, the long diagonal, as well as the other a2 through g8 diagonal, which as we'll see will be crucial to the solution. Also, the black knight on b7 is quite misplaced, because his own pawns on c5 and d6 are greatly limiting the mobility of that knight. True, the knight on d1 of White's is not the greatest positioned piece at the moment either, but it has a much brighter potential just in a move or two, moving to e3 or f2, and then centralize maybe through f2 on e4. However, it's not the key element in this position. The king's safety is always a dominant factor in every position, and especially in situations when a king has no legal move. Like here, the black king on h8, as we can see, because of the very centralized, excellent position of the white bishop on d5, has no move. So imagine if the black queen could be lured away from where it is, guarding that key dark-squared long diagonal. Naturally, if white would have his other bishop as well, the dark-squared bishop, and that could get to that long diagonal, black would be already in serious trouble. But luckily for black, white does not have the second bishop. What white is trying to achieve here is to get his queen to that diagonal to attack, and of course without giving black the opportunity to exchange the queens. Try to think of the move that deflects the black queen from that diagonal. There is a beautiful, brilliant solution that involves a double rook sacrifice. Hopefully you found the solution yourself, and here it is. The rook from e1 moves to e7, attacking the black queen. Of course, it would be losing to move the queen, let's say to d4, to check, because after the exchange of queens, white would checkmate on h7. But what happens after the queen actually captures the rook? Well then, finally, the white queen gets comfortably to the long diagonal with a check. But this is not a checkmate. Black can block the check. Here in the actual game, black blocked the check with the rook. But what would have happened if black responds with a natural move, blocking the check with the queen, and goes back to g7? Well then, white is ready for a second brilliant rook sacrifice. Rook takes h7. Now, because of the pin along the long diagonal, the queen is not allowed to capture the rook. On the other hand, after king takes rook on h7, the h-file now is fully open, and all white needs to do is to swing the queen over, check on h2. The king still has no moves. All black can do is block the check, possibly first with the bishop, then with the queen, and then white just captures those pieces, and it's checkmate. What a brilliant combination. Let's move on to the next position, which is a famous combination. In this position, white's advantage in development is quite clear. Black still needs a move to castle, and even that is not quite as simple, because imagine if it were black's turn and black would castle, the e7 pawn would be hanging with a check. However, on the other hand, if white takes his time, black slowly but surely may get to finish development. So white needs to play aggressively. Moving the knight to c7 in this position would be a nice idea if the black queen couldn't capture it. In fact, if the black queen could not capture the knight on c7, it would result in a checkmate in 2. And using that idea, white has a beautiful opportunity to deflect the black queen from the c7 square. As usual, try to stop for a moment and come back listening to the solution after you think you found the correct solution for white. And the answer is Queen a4 check, which in a way is a fork, meaning that if the black queen does not capture the queen, of course, black just loses a queen. And if the queen captures, white is ready to checkmate in 3, by knight c7 check, forcing the king away from the rook, followed by rook captures rook, and checkmate right on the next move. Let's move on to the next famous tactic. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn. It's quite clear that black has the advantage. Besides the fact that black has an extra pawn, while both kings are in somewhat delicate position, it's clear that the white king is in even more danger than black's. But we also have to notice that right now, at this moment, the black bishop is in a pin. If it wouldn't be, black could checkmate in one move by playing bishop to b5. So here is the task, to unpin the bishop. Of course, black better hurries up and make some forceful, energetic move, because otherwise, white may make a move like bishop g4, for example, using the pin, or maybe queen to c7, threatening with some unpleasant checks by capturing the pawn on d6. Again, try to think, what would you do if you were having the black pieces here? And here, the correct move is rook a8. A very nice move, attacking the white queen. If the white queen moves away along the 7th rank, even to c7, maintaining the pin over the bishop, then all of a sudden the black rook becomes the hero by checkmating with rook a2. And of course, if queen takes rook, then bishop b5 checkmates. This is also from a real game between Mebius and Hennings from 1973. The next example I've taken from a very famous game between former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik versus the legendary Russian-Estonian Grandmaster Paul Keres. This game has been played in 1966 in Moscow. In this position, we can see that the white pawn on g6 is very far advanced and can be a very strong aid to the attack. Of course, have to remember that if the attack fails, that very same pawn, being so close to black's territory, surrounded by black pieces, may become a target as well, a weakness. But at the moment, most of the pieces are still on the board, and white is ready to attack. Just imagine if the white queen would get to come somehow to the H file without being captured, of course. That would pretty much end the game, because if the white queen could get to H7, that would be devastating for black. But how can white achieve that? For the moment, the black queen protects the pawn on H4, and the black knight on d4 safeguards the e2 or f3 squares, which could be the route for the white queen to get to h5. And also, after bishop takes knight on d4 at the moment, just the second knight would arrive to the same place and taking over that very same task that the current knight does. And again, we're using the same motive of deflection. We want that queen from d8 to be gone, not to protect the pawn on h4. And again, we're willing to do that almost at all cost. So the correct move is rook to b8, attacking the queen. Of course, black may avoid the quick checkmate by giving his queen up, but naturally that wouldn't alter the outcome much of the game. Black takes the rook, and queen captures, threatening checkmate on h7, and moving the rook away, giving the king space to escape to f8, doesn't really help, because after queen h7, check, king f8, the knight on d5 comes in handy, guarding the e7 potential escape square of the king, and the checkmate has arrived. What a beautiful example. And let's see a more modern example played by between grandmasters Yapishin and Smagin in 1995. And here is the position. In this position we have material balance, but white's advantage is naturally obvious here. There is a advanced pawn on d6 that black is busy guarding, making sure it doesn't advance further. But black has bigger troubles than just that pawn, actually. And white here made a series of very nice moves. Black has a weakness on f6, but at the moment the black king is guarding it. It's also a great example why it's usually a good idea to connect your pawns and have pawn chains, like for example black has here on the queen side. Here white started with an amazing move, the little pawn, moving it to h6 with the idea to deflect the black king from the f6 pawn. If the black king would move, including capturing that pawn on h6, white would be ready to capture the pawn on f6 with a knight, which would be very devastating for black. However, what happens if the black knight captures on h6? Well, this was the whole point behind the first sacrifice, to follow it up with the second one. And here, white is combining the idea of luring the black king out all the way to the middle of the board. For example, after king captures knight, white would continue with rook exchange in the middle of the board. Now the black king is out there in trouble, and especially as long as there are queens and other pieces on the board, it's rarely a good idea. And in this case, white immediately has a few unpleasant checks for black, and winning the rook with a check on the following move. But let's go back and see what happens if after h6, knight takes, knight sacrifice on f6, black is trickier than that, and gives an intermediate check on c6. You may wonder, what's the idea? Well, the idea is simple. Remember, in the last variation, black suffered because the rook on d7 at the end of the variation was unprotected. With this check, black now protects the rook, so after the king moves out of the check, and black captures the knight, rook captures rook, and king captures the rook, the same idea wouldn't quite work for white, because after queen e3 check, king f6, queen e6, king g7, the black rook is protected. However, white had a different plan that works this time, and that is playing f4 check. Now, if pawn trades, queen captures back, and the black knight will be captured with a check on the following move. And what happened in the game, king f6 allowed, again, giving a fork, and then simply capturing the knight on h6. As a result, white has won a pawn, and besides that, the black king is still in a very sensitive position, and after a followed queen g5, black is in serious trouble and lost shortly. A very nice example of deflection. Let's move on to the next position. Here we go. This game is also from a real game between Oliva and Pedzich. In this position, it is black's turn. It's clear that black has been trying to put pressure on the g2 pawn with his queen and knight, trying to checkmate. But it seems that white has been doing a good job in defending against it with his queen. Also, at the same time, black has put himself into a pin. Look at the black knight. If the black knight would move away to most places, the black queen would be captured. And moving the knight with a check to h3 wouldn't really solve the problems either, because after king h1, now black is stuck, both the queen and the knight being under attack. Going back to the starting position, think, how can yet black save the day? It's quite clear that if the white queen could be deflected, white would be in trouble because queen would capture on g2 and checkmate. But how can we accomplish that? Capturing the white knight on c3 would be an attempt. The problem is that beside the white queen, also the white pawn would be able to recapture, and of course white should choose that, and then the black knight in the pin would be in serious trouble. On the other hand, black has an excellent, beautiful move here by playing bishop to d4. As we know, the queen cannot capture because of the checkmate. The bishop is pinned. The white bishop is pinned now, therefore it cannot take the knight. And if the bishop takes the black bishop, then the typical discovery with knight h3 and then capturing the white queen on d2. In the actual game, after bishop d4, white responded with rook e1 to avoid losing major material, and then black again played bishop takes. The white queen cannot capture again because it's busy guarding on g2, only the rook. And now, the queen is still too busy protecting two things, the pawn on g2 and the rook on e3, and black can take advantage of this by immediately capturing knight g2, winning a pawn and destroying the safe defense of the white king with the pawn on g2. Now, if queen takes knight, then queen takes rook, and otherwise, after the rook moves away, which it did in the game, the black knight simply moves back to f4, keeping an extra pawn, and the decisive attack. What a brilliant game! That bishop d4 move is really, really nice. What's important in these positions, that A, you connect the ideas of removing the guard of deflection, but also that you try to remember the specific ideas also, not necessarily the exact position, because chances are low that you'll ever have the same exact position, but you may have a very similar one. Therefore, try to remember the ideas. Let's move on to the next position. Here we go. This is a position between Grandmasters Barca and Simagin from 1949. Even though White has an extra pawn in this position, definitely it's White who has to be nervous because one of the black pawns, the one on d2, is so far advanced, and the black king and knight are right around it, protecting it, and in fact supporting it in trying to promote. At the same time, if black would right away move the king to e2, trying to aid the promotion, the white knight would get to c3 with a check. And things wouldn't be so simple, or in fact the knight would go to d4, check even better. However, if black could cut out that knight from the defense, things would be simple. And that's exactly what Grandmaster Simagin did. Played knight a3, check, kind of making a fork, and then, when the knight took, then king e2, and now the white knight is not in a position to prevent the black pawn's promotion. What a nice example. And finally, let's see the brilliancy of the weak. In this position, there are very few pieces left on the board, and white has a clear material advantage. However, black has a pawn on d2 that's about to promote. It seems that's not a hard task to stop by just capturing the pawn on d3, and then the newly promoted queen after d1. The catch is that with the resultant position, black has achieved stalemate and actually has escaped the loss. How can white still win the game? Take your time and try to figure out the correct solution. This study has been composed by Prokop in 1929, and by the way, this is just the end of that beautiful study. The beautiful move is moving the bishop to e7. One idea is that now, if the king captures, then rook captures and no more stalemate around, and white wins easily. But what happens if after bishop e7, black actually promotes the pawn? Now rook d8 is just a check, because the white bishop is on e7 hanging. Now white has a quiet move, after which amazingly, there's nothing that black can do from stopping the checkmate, of course other than giving his queen up on h5. What a beautiful endgame. Well, thank you for listening, and hopefully you got some new ideas about deflection, and that you can use in your future games. Thank you, and until next week.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe.